we're doing an LA London, thing here. Michael, welcome.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Considering, the perfect storm of everything happening at the same time out there, I'm actually doing pretty good. How's it going in London?
Well, strangely enough, we're having a few weeks of wonderful sunny weather, which is really welcomed in September. So we've been very blessed.
No umbrellas. Is this like what they would call Indian summer here?
Yeah, in the U.S., yes, and in England they call it highly unusual and very a happy time.
Yeah, no, that is a good time. Hey, so people know who you are, could you briefly give a
Sure.
formal introduction of yourself, a little bit of background, and then we'll chat?
Yes, absolutely. Well, hi, I'm Mike Kilander. I am a husband of 26 years to my wife Lori, father of 3 boys. All of them out of the house now and off to university and making their way in life. So we're recently empty nesters. I currently lead a global data and software business out of London. I grew up in Indiana. I like to say where the cornfields meet the steel mills. That's where I grew up. I lived around a number of places around the world, mostly the courtesy of the U.S. Army, then later business. My biggest move was from a tent in Bosnia to a suburb in Southern California, which was quite the cultural shock.
I bet.
Been there. I've had a fairly eclectic career. So Army officer, then business strategy consultant, a number of startups, and then into financial services, where I've been in the last 15, 16 years. But the one thing that's really consistent through all of that is even the military tie with business is managing change and identifying very difficult thorny problems and how to manage change through them. I also come with a little bit of a strange background in terms of perspective of a lot of executives. Normally somebody have it on their resume, an MBA, but in my case, it's public policy. So I tend to think of things a little bit broader than the company. My interests will lie in a little bit broader than simply the business objective. So that's, at least my education, my background is a little dissimilar than most executives.
Well, that's why we couldn't have a Leaders Who Care series if we didn't have you on, because of reasons like that. So, no, thanks for that, and we'll get into a little bit of that. But I want to ask you first, it's kind of like the why question, but I ask it in a little bit different way. More specifically, Michael, why do you do what you do?
Well, for me, when I take a job or I look at a job, the thing that always gets me out of bed in the morning is there a tough problem to solve? Is it a very thorny issue? Is it a cultural issue, a technical issue, a marketing issue? What's the challenge? And the harder it is and the more intractable it is, the more I seem to be attracted to it. And I look through my career, particularly in this company I've been in the last 16 years, every stop I've had or posting I've had, that's been the consistent theme, which is we've had a really difficult, challenging business problem. And invariably, the solution was a lot different than when we thought it was starting out. And also invariably included some culture change to be able to manage through it. So the thornier and stickier it is, the more attracted I am.
Sounds like, reminds me of what was John F. Kennedy's quote about we take on the hardest things to do because we want to, or something to that effect.
Yeah, and I think also it was something that's really important to me, which is that if it's a challenge where I'm not learning, or if I think I know the answer before I start, then it's not going to be very interesting to be able to address. And
I think that's what really good people look for these days, and it's another reason why we commit to working with leaders who care about their people, care what's going on in the world, because that's where great people want, and that's who great people want to work with at the end of the day. So kind of leads to my next point is, it's kind of taken decades for corporate leaders and brands to realize that aligning with social environmental impact is actually good for business, not to mention, as we say, good for attracting talent. So as you said, you've been engaged in intelligence and data, being a captain in the Army. to an executive in major corporate and in different countries, seeing all sorts of different things in different cultures. A little bit what I call a push question, and partly revealing the answer too, is what do you think makes you or differentiates you as one of the leaders who cares?
Well, I think that eclectic background certainly gives a different perspective. But I think what it really comes down to for me is a approach to leadership. That background gives perhaps a different approach to leadership. And what I mean by that is when you're operating in that different number of cultures and in different types of environments and in the kind of challenges that you face in a military situation that we faced when we went into Bosnia, or a startup faces when they're trying to pivot to a new business model. These types of challenges require humility. And that was really the lesson I learned, which is that leadership requires continuous learning. And continuous learning rests on a bedrock of humility. And if you don't have that, you're going to struggle. You're going to have a very difficult time. Leadership, setting up high performance organizations through accountability structures, through clear goals, through clear metrics is all very important. But if you want to get at that all important strategic why am I here doing this? What is the real principle that we're driving after? What's the strategic vision? If you really want to answer that question, whether it's in the military or whether it's in business, when you're dealing with tough problems, you've got to approach it with a continuous learning and humility. And that's something I learned very early on when we went to Bosnia. We were a heavy armored division that was trained to know where the Soviet tanks were coming through the Fulda Gap. And that's what we've been trained for. Going into Bosnia, we knew where all the weapons were. It had nothing to do with the weapons or the tanks. What it had to do with was political violence, assassinations, murders, riots, bombings. And that required us to think of the world entirely differently as soon as we landed on the ground. And we, frankly, when we first got there, weren't really sure what the problem was or how to solve it. But we had to continue learning as fast as we could and adjusting and taking risk. And that's the second part. The continuous learning coupled with an ability to take calculated risks. Because if you're not taking risks, then you're not really changing anything.
Yeah, there's I always remember Dyson, the vacuum cleaner guy, and everything, and a bunch of other stuff. He's got an institute, I think it's in London even, where he hires engineers basically to fail, because they got to keep failing to keep making something better, if you will. And
that's tough for corporations. I mean, it's very popular now to talk about fail, fast forward. I think there was even a book by that name, and this notion of learning what doesn't work as fast as you can lead to great outcomes. I fundamentally believe that's true. It's really based on this notion of you learn a lot more by stubbing your toe than by studying without committing to any sort of action. And I think that's true. It reminds me a lot of what Eisenhower said on D-Day, and I'm going to butcher it and paraphrase it, but essentially what he said is plans are worthless, but planning is priceless. And what he meant by that is when the bullets start, the plans are really out the window. But that planning process you went through is going to teach you to make decisions and give you more educated bets, if you will, allow you to take risk in a more calculated way. But the reality is you have to learn and adjust quickly. And I think that lesson applies to business as well. But I think a lot of companies struggle with it. And where I see a lot of that struggle is when it gets to capital allocation and finance and how we think about financial modeling. I think still has a way to catch up to that type of thinking.
It's super interesting. I guess I can use maybe a couple other examples that we were just chatting about was, again, to sports, and a lot of the NHL, NBA are in playoffs right now. You can't just turn it on in the playoffs type of thing. You're developing through the whole regular season to be able to act in the playoffs, if this is a good analogy to what you're talking about. And the players that knows the coach is 100% behind them and learning along the way, showing mistakes, talking about mistakes honestly, and then the coach says, get out there and we need you, you're going to do great, versus firing the person or being pissed at the person and benching them. You're actually building the blocks. When you get to the playoffs, you're just doing it. You're not, like you said, you're not thinking of the plans or whatnot. You're doing it. Another example that came up, we talked about, these were older guys, including me, talking about arithmetic. Remember that? Arithmetic?
Mhm.
Versus math. And we were always smart in math, and we would get the answer, but we never got the full grades because the teacher wouldn't give us the full grades unless we showed the whole work. And there was a reason, basically, and we didn't quite get it then, but how can you get people to follow you if they don't know and learn what your whole process is, what your whole thinking is, where you're going with it versus just the answer? So
Yeah, that's one of the things I had to. I've had, it's one of the first challenges you have when you take over these organizations is, and what people really want to know is, okay, you're going to be disruptive. There's going to be a lot of change. You're going to change my world. What I want to know is, as an employee of yours, are you going to take the same risk I'm taking?
right.
And that's one of the things I think it's so important to move out of the office, move into the bullpen, move into the floor, make sure that you're among the people you're asking to go on this ride with you. And because it's one of the challenges I think companies face, and you still get it in some industries where you get this notion of the infallible executive, the corner office infallible executive.
Right.
The problem is it doesn't really create a spirit of cohesion of we're all in this together, we're going to take this risk together. And it doesn't particularly bode well or serve the notion of continuous learning either. But I think I've seen a lot of change in that over the last 10 years, which all in a positive direction.
Yeah, and I actually a lot of potential dramatic change right now because of everything happening. And I mentioned this a lot. My grandparents always used to say, they were from Kiev, and they said it with the accent, as long as you have your health, that's the most important thing. And it wasn't a slogan. It's because of all they went through, they knew what was important. So kind of related to what we're talking about, I'd like your thoughts on, we have COVID, we have technology still going full speed ahead. We got the tipping point, which was inevitable, about racial justice, and that needs dramatic change there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Mini earthquakes, wildfire, I mean, you name it. So people have had more time to think to some degree, call it an awakening, whatever. How do you see our awareness looking in the near future to the future about our work, about our home, about our community?
Despite everything you listed, Mark, and I agree with all of my problems, I'm extraordinarily positive, optimistic. And I'll tell you why, which is, first I'll give you a couple observations. What I see with COVID, with racial injustice, with all the challenges that we face from globalization in terms of displacement and change, and also all the change and the continuous change that came with the technology, the internet and the successive technology waves after that, is it's made the world incredibly small, and it just keeps getting smaller. The notion of things like COVID and climate change and media, there's very few things that happen one side of the world that don't affect the other side of the world.
Right.
And there's nothing that occurs on one side of the world that the other side of the world doesn't know within seconds. And those two things are entirely new to human history. I mean, that's something that happened in the last century, towards the end of the last century.
Yeah.
And I think we're still learning how to manage that and deal with that, everything from media and also in terms of, go back to my sort of international relations, but it's sort of interstate actors and how nations cooperate on some of these challenges. But to your point, I think there's a growing, where I become positive, is a couple areas. One, I think there's a growing awareness that these challenges are pervasive, that they are global in nature, and that they cannot be solved in isolation. And that includes companies. That companies cannot act in isolation simply focusing on shareholder value.
Right.
They're either part of the problem or they're part of the solution. And where I also get positive is I see huge changes in the generation coming behind us. It's probably the least racist, most educated, and the least tolerant of or let me put it this way, they are the most active in holding entities, including companies, accountable.
Yeah, I think you're so right on. I think every generation, we all grew up rebelling, we got to make our own difference type of thing. But there's an urgency, and there's a great issue of we want to make money, but not in sacrifice of everything else type of thing. And and it's not like we don't want to make money just to do good. We want to do both. And so I think, in fact, I see these questions being asked by candidates all the time to me when we're taking on searches is, do they have a well-being program? What is it? Do they care about diversity? Do they care about the planet? What programs do they have? Not just tell me there's an open door policy, I'm here for you if you want me, type of thing only. That's good. But they want to know real stuff before they'll take a job. And in some ways, I think that's where the Leaders Who Care mantra, if you will, came, is that the leaders who care are finding they're the only ones that can really get that talent that will only come if that's there.
Yeah, and that's a really important point. We see it in my own industry, my own company, which is the importance of maximizing shareholder value. Driving the business isn't going to change, but what has changed is if you want the talent to be able to do that, you're going to have to be not only holding yourself accountable, but your employees will hold that company accountable to making sure that you're not working in isolation. You're actually addressing the issues in the community around you in which you operate.
And it's different, to your point about international or smaller world. We're all different. And diversity is obviously critical. And inclusion is even more critical. What's interesting is even two white guys here are diverse. We're not the same. We might have commonalities, obviously, but we're different too. And I'd love to ask you, as we know, in close to time here, I'd love to ask you, what do you think the role is for, if you will, business leaders who care to play with respect to what I believe there's three types of well-being that people want: financial well-being, physical well-being, and mental well-being. So what role do business leaders have to play to make that happen?
Well, I think that all three are important. As we were just discussing, if you want to be successful, an entity wants to be successful long-term, they can't do it, as we said, in isolation. And what does that mean for folks leading those types of companies? Well, it means having a broader vision, a broader framework in terms of how they judge success in the company. I also think it means greater empathy for employees, greater empathy for the community around them, and the consequences of what they do or don't do. And that's going to be, I think, increasingly important. Everything from valuing diversity to participating in say, underprivileged or challenged communities in the physical location or the community in which you operate. And the third thing is, I think it's going to mean business leaders are going to have to become even more, and will have to embrace change even more. It's a huge theme since the late 90s and the rapid evolution of business models and everything the internet brought, the notion of change. But the question I would have is, how truly good are we at actually embracing it and taking advantage of it? Not simply from a business perspective, but understanding the impact that change is having on your community around you as well. Because what I would argue is that there is, when you think of a community, you think of your country, you think of sort of international entities, you think of your employees. Those things used to be very segmented in terms of how people thought. They had their family, they had their community, and they had their work. And those things didn't overlap particularly much. I went to work to make money. And the three communities stayed in isolation, but I don't see that as happening. So that means we'll have to be engaged, and we'll have to be embracing of not only business change, but social change.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant statement. It's not, we like to categorize things a lot, and including people. And in fact, I was talking to an investor the other day, and I think the worst thing a startup likes to hear is like, "Oh, you're just like this," right? Type of thing. You don't want to be just like, you want to be special. But to your point, I've read studies where they say the thing that fills people's hearts and souls more than anything, aside from food and air, which is a need, is belonging to more than one thing, not just one thing, to your point. And it's a human thing. We need it.
Yeah, I agree.
So I'm glad we belong. And
yes.
And as I've got to know you and what you've done, especially your international experience, it's great stuff. So I definitely consider you one of the leaders who cares. And thanks for participating.
Absolutely, really enjoyed it. Happy to share any of the experiences. And one little bit of tidbit I would give, it goes back to the beginning of this, one of the biggest lessons I've learned is that humility and confidence are not mutually exclusive. They are, in fact, the best of friends. And that if you're taking on a job or considering a job, it doesn't scare you because of the things that you clearly don't know, then it's probably not worth your time.
And life's too short. So, great wisdom. Thanks for sharing that.
Great.